But it was actually the states united that talked about this. It was Connecticut that they passed a resolution talking about nullification. It says that this is the Connecticut resolution of 1809, okay? It says, resolved that to preserve the Union and support the Constitution of the United States, it becomes the duty of the legislatures of the states in such a crisis of affairs vigilantly to watch over and vigorously to maintain the powers not delegated to the United States but reserved to the states. So nullification is how you preserve the country.
Oh, Zion, dear Zion, home of the free.
This Defending Utah presentation brought to you by the Defending Utah Liberty Store, the new book, The United States Constitution Made Easy, by Lonnie D. Crockett, Ph.D., Anderson Accounting, Trust Plumbing, Higher Calling Firearms, Mini Zoo Comes to You, American Appliance, The Editor Lady, Shem Financial Services, and the law offices of Garrett T. Smith.
Good morning, Utah, and welcome to the New Guard Show. I am your host, Jacob Hibbard, coming to you live on K-Talk AM 1640. So glad you decided to make us part of your morning. And I am joined this morning by the one, the only, the Ben McClintock, our prophet of lamentation and woe. I've said it 3 weeks in a row. I might as well keep saying it.
My new thing.
It's your new thing. I need to get you a sticker or something. But we're super excited and happy to have Ben joining us this morning in studio. We are also streaming live on Facebook Live. We've been asked that you be able to see our bright, shining faces, and so
nobody wants to see
we will give you. We're doing it for you, the people. We are giving you what you want, and apparently you want to see us. And so we are on Facebook Live. One person
wrote in, and now we're all in trouble.
Yeah, so we're on Facebook Live. You can follow us there. You can send us questions if you have any there as well. It's just a great way to get a peek behind the scenes of what's going on while we're on the air, and another way to interact with us. And so that's got to be pretty great, right?
You can hear what we're talking about during the commercial break.
Exactly. Find out what big nerds that Ben and I are, things that we talk about during the breaks. But we are, like I said, we are super excited to have Ben in studio this morning. He comes in every Wednesday, and we really appreciate you doing that. It's been a great asset to our show. And it always has great knowledge and great insight. So thank you, Ben.
Thank you. Always good to be here.
So last week we talked about the Convention of States on Wednesday, and then we had, I guess, the rebuttal to your show on Thursday. And since we've talked a lot about the Convention of States, and one of the major focuses that they say that a lot of them point to, and that Sam and Michael pointed to when we were on the show, is that the states were supposed to be a major check and balance to the federal government, and we see that expressed in the 10th Amendment to the United States. Mm-hmm. And they said that with the passing of the 17th Amendment, that essentially the states have been taken off the board, nullifications off the board. There's no process for nullification. We can't use it, so we need to amend the Constitution through a Convention of States to essentially create that mechanism and create a process for nullification to take place and to bring the states back into play, basically restore the states to their position in the Constitution. And so that conversation, and it got me thinking more and more about nullification, the 10th Amendment. How is this supposed to work? How it is working? Does it work? And just kind of to address that aspect of the Constitution. And I know that you've done a lot of work and research into the 10th Amendment, how nullification works, and we talked a little about that. This is something that we wanted to address.
Yeah, I think it's important because it's the tool the Founding Fathers actually gave us to fix an out-of-control government, as opposed to what the different tool in which they gave when the Constitution was insufficient.
Mm-hmm. And there's a book I've started listening to. Suzanne Sherman recommended it to me yesterday. It's called The Founder's Guide to the Constitution. And I'm only in chapter 3 or so, but they've already talked about the Senate and how Congress kind of works, but specifically the Senate, and even just the way that elections are had with states being the ones who select their senators to represent them, and even how they're compensated. And what's been so amazing to me is how the Founding Fathers really saw the Senate, as a major check on all aspects of government, because treaties, a lot of the foreign policy, big picture kind of national issues have to go through the Senate. And why the Senate? Because the Senate is not the representative of the people. The Senate is the representation of the states.
Well, at least it was supposed to
At least
be.
that's the in the Constitution itself, pre 17th Amendment.
Right.
That's how it works. Is
Right.
the Senate, as a senator, I'm accountable to the state legislature, and the idea is, the anticipation was, state legislatures and states are going to be very jealous of their power. They're going to want to make sure that their influence and their rights and their abilities is going to be respected by the federal government.
Right.
And by them being jealous of their power, it protects us, the people, as well, from an overzealous
Right.
federal government. And so when the 17th Amendment comes in there and changes castes, we've essentially have two houses of Congress now, two houses of representative, all accountable to the people, not the states.
And not even that, accountable to the big cities of their state. Because all of a sudden it becomes just the big cities that elect as opposed to your congressman. At least there's broken up into smaller districts, or you've got some more representation of different parts of the state, where the Senate is basically it's kind of like if you got rid of the Electoral College. Only the big areas are going to get represented, and that's the same thing that's going on with the U.S. Senate.
Absolutely. And so let's dive into the 10th Amendment. I think it's always good to read the text itself so that nobody can accuse you of wrangling with the Constitution.
Right.
That's not what my Constitution says, and things of that nature. But I've got it pulled up here. And I think this was a good exercise that we did last time when we were reading about how the Convention of States is supposed to work. Because one thing that and when they came in and talked, I could do a whole debriefing about their visit and talk about where I stand on this, but that's not what we're talking about today. Maybe if we have time later, I can kind of show my hand about how I feel about this. But this is what the 10th Amendment says. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, so all the enumerated powers and things we've just read, if you read the rest of the Constitution.
So there is enumerated powers, right?
There are enumerated powers.
Specific
powers given to Congress. It's in Article 1, Section 8.
Yep.
That is where you have the enumerated powers. So all powers not delegated to the United States by this Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states. So if it's not given to the Congress or the executive or the judiciary explicitly, and there's no prohibition on the states in here either, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And that's a reference also to the 9th Amendment, which is one of my favorite amendments that is never used. And the reason why it's never used is because it gives the people too much power. And that says that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people, which is wonderful, which is basically just because we wrote the Bill of Rights and it says you have a Second Amendment or a First Amendment, and you don't see your rights, a certain right that you have, like, say, contract, which is usually falls under, in modern thought, under liberty, but contract, which is a right that every individual has. The founders believed in natural rights, and they're not all in the Bill of Rights. This basically says, you're enjoying it, it's yours, which is great. But that just shows where the heart and mind of the founders were.
Right.
Is they had just rebelled from a tyranny. They had just rebelled from a king, from an overpowerful central government. The last thing they wanted to do is to make another one. And that's why, as Thomas Jefferson said, they chained it down with a constitution.
Right.
And
so our job is to bind them down.
Exactly. We have to apply the lock and make sure that the joints and the rings are strong, and the 10th Amendment is a major part of that chain.
And what you lay out there in the 9th and 10th Amendment is essential to understanding the basic foundation, is that the Constitution, it literally only is a law for the government. The delegated duties to the government are few and defined. Mm-hmm. The powers of the people are many and undefined. Mm-hmm. They're saying whatever we didn't talk about here is yours.
They call it a free society for a reason.
It's actually the reader document. In every legal document, they have this section where they tell you how to read the rest of it. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what the 9th and 10th Amendments are, is how to read the rest of the document.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, we've got a caller who wants to weigh in. Good morning, caller. Welcome to the New Guard Show. What's your name and where are you calling us from?
If you read the preamble to the Bill of Rights, that is actually your reader document for the 9th and 10th Amendments, and actually for all of them. But it says that before ratification, certain states expressed a desire to have even more limiting powers put on the government. It says that very plainly in that preamble to the Bill of Rights. And then, so that's the explanation of why the enumerated rights were listed, and then the underlining of the 9th and 10th Amendments of, and this isn't all of them, and it's reserved for the people. So there's your explanative clause in that preamble to the Bill of Rights, and that's an important little paragraph to read in conjunction with the rest of the Bill of Rights. It really, they go hand in glove and really put the capstone on that these were meant to limit the federal government, not the people.
Absolutely. That's a really great point. I've actually never read the preamble to the Bill of Rights. I did not know that they had one. See, one of the great things about this show is I get an opportunity to learn from you guys and from Ben about these things, because these are important things, and so I'll have to try to find that, and maybe we can read it later on in the show and share that with the audience. And so right before we took the call, we talked about 9th and 10th Amendment are the reader. What was the phrase that you used? The reader's guide.
Yeah, the reader's clause, basically.
The reader's clause to the Constitution. And so, how does nullification work with the 10th Amendment? Because usually they go together. How does that work?
Well, that's exactly what it's about. And so, I think we need to have even a more sure foundation.
Okay.
First, I want to back up a little bit of what the nation was founded upon. Okay, before the United States was organized, every other nation on the planet was based on this idea of the divine rights of kings, where the king had absolute authority, and any right that you had was at his will.
If a watery wench throws a sword at you, then I guess that makes you king.
Right. Exactly. And so Ezra Taft Benson, in The Proper Role of Government, he lays this out. He says, starting at the foundation of the pyramid, let us first consider the origin of those freedoms we have come to know as human rights. There are only two possible sources. Rights are either God-given as part of the divine plan, or they are granted by government as part of the political plan. Reason, necessity, tradition, and religious convictions all lead me to accept the divine origin of these rights. If we accept the premise that human rights are granted by government, then we must be willing to accept the corollary that they can be denied by government. I, for one, shall never accept that premise. America was founded upon the idea that your individual rights come from God, and that government's only job is to protect those rights. That's their job. And anything above that is illegal and an usurpation of their authority. And so we have this, again, these big debates. You talked about the Founding Fathers. They were going through this time of getting rid of this oppressive government. And so then all of a sudden they were coming up with this new government, a new central, right, the general government that people were really worried about. It was going to be out of control. And so they wanted to make sure that there was the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And so because of the objections of the Anti-Federalists, they put in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, to make sure that everybody knew that the federal government couldn't do what they weren't allowed to do.
Because what the Anti-Federalists argued was that the Constitution left things way too open for a big government to grow and to advance.
Right.
And the Federalists said, no, this doesn't. We have enumerated powers in here, and because they're enumerated, anybody with a brain is going to be able to understand that this is all, that when it says this is what the powers of Congress are, that's all that they are, and they can't go beyond that. Well, obviously, there are a lot of people in this country without a brain, and the Anti-Federalists have been proven right in the sense that
it's one of those conundrums. You wonder, if they hadn't had the Bill of Rights, would we have lasted as long as we have, or would it have been remained obvious that the government didn't have the authority?
Perhaps that's the thing, and I think, unfortunately, government, because government is flawed, has looked at the Constitution and specifically the Bill of Rights as a recipe of how to act, as opposed to a chain around it restraining its actions. And I can't remember there was it was one of the opinions that the Supreme Court wrote about the death penalty, and it said, well, it's in the Constitution, and the Constitution isn't a way of giving us a way to restrict this right. It's actually supposed to be protecting it, and so we can't restrict X, Y,
Right.
Z. I think it wasn't a death penalty case. It was a different case. But I think that mentality, though, has definitely arisen within America, is that the Constitution is, okay, if I want to get this done, how do I wrangle with the Bill of Rights, or how do I twist this power to make it work? And instead of seeing as a hard line, as a barrier to action at all.
The government, exactly. And so the Founding Fathers were very clear about their intention. This was a contract. You know, we look at, okay, so who's the creator? So who creates government? I mean, people have inalienable rights. They have God-given rights. And so then they gather together to be able to exercise those rights as a group, and they form government.
Because outside of government, you have rights in name only.
Right.
You have tyranny, you have chaos.
Because you've got, just might makes right type of a situation.
If you want proof of that, look at post-Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans.
And immoral people without any way to enforce their debauchery. So they go to the next step of the states are created, and we're going to a break. So I will finish
we're going to
that
go to a
thought
break
when we get back.
But we will be right back. This is the New Guard Show.
Tired of bureaucrats and tyrannical government? Defending Utah knows how to fix that. It's called nullification. To find out more, stop by our office and pick up your pamphlet on nullification today. DefendingUtah.org. Think right and wrong, not right and left.
And welcome back, folks. Welcome to the New Guard Show. I am your host, Jacob Hibbard, coming to you live on K-Talk AM 1640. And we are joined this morning by Ben McClintock from Defending Utah. And we are having a great conversation about the overall topic is about the 10th Amendment and nullification and how that works. But before we get there, we're trying to lay the foundation of why do we have a government? What were the ideas that formed the basis of the Constitution? What were the founders thinking? And how that informs everything else that follows. You can't understand what the 10th Amendment and nullification means.
Context matters.
The context matters. The basis. It's kind of like you're in a recipe, or you have to start at the top and read down, and you won't understand why you're doing this at this point of the program if you haven't done the first steps.
Which is why this is probably a good podcast. If you're just tuning in, go back and download the podcast.
Because we're dropping some great truth bombs here on you guys. So
before the break, I was talking about what is the formation of government? People have natural rights; they form government, and in the beginning of our general government, we were all, and we still are, individual nations that formed a general government. This basic treaty amongst them, and so they gave the general government, these individual nation states, gave the general government certain enumerated powers. And so the Founding Fathers wanted to make sure that they understood the limits of that, and also because this is a contract. Let's enter a contract, right? And in this contract, Jacob, you and I'm the only one that's allowed to tell you what the contract means.
Okay.
Does that sound like a contract you want to engage in?
No.
I mean, it'd be insane. And the Founding Fathers recognized that. There's one Founding Father that the anti-nullification people, the anti-Constitution people like to bring up and say was anti-nullification, which is completely false. It's James Madison.
Yeah, that's not true at all. You can find I saw a quote just yesterday from him saying that nullification is the great protection of the state. I'd have to look it up specifically, but no, he was pro-nullification.
People say that the courts are the final arbiter of what the law is, right?
9 black-robed kings and queens.
And so and we need to go to the Founding Fathers. What did they say? James Madison said the states, then being the parties to the Constitutional Compact and in their sovereign capacity, it follows of necessity that there can be no tribunal above their authority. Okay? The Founding Fathers are saying that the states are the ultimate authority on what is constitutional and what is not. It is not. It is not the courts to decide to the last resort whether the compact made by them be violated. They are the last authority of what is violated, if the Constitution is violated. And consequently, that as the parties to it, they must themselves decide in the last resort such questions as may be of sufficient magnitude to require their interposition. meaning nullification, okay? So it is the people that say there is no legal mechanism to enforce the 10th Amendment, to enforce nullification, I say exactly. The 10th Amendment says that if we don't talk about it in the Constitution, it's left up to the states. And that's exactly what the Founding Fathers said. They said if you're the final arbiter of what's constitutional and you are the final decider of how you are going to nullify an action.
And just to build off just a little bit what you said about how the Constitution is a legal binding contract. A lot of people like to say, well, the Constitution is ambiguous. There are words and phrases that we can't really be sure what they mean. But the thing is, the Constitution is a contract, and we have common law protocols for what do you do when you have a ambiguous contract. So even if we accept the premise that the Constitution has ambiguous terms, according to common law, what you do then is you go to the people, you go outside the four corners of the contract, and you talk to the people who wrote the contract.
Right.
That means the Founding Fathers. And that means we can go to people like Madison and all these great writers and say, okay, what did you mean by this?
Right.
And when we do that, we come to very clear conclusion that this is all about limiting government. And in this particular instance, the states are the final arbiters of what is constitutional. It's their contract. They wrote it, and they're the ones who are going to be deciding ultimately, and the people through the states,
Right.
what they agreed to and whether the terms of the contract they made are being upheld by the federal government.
Right. And so, exactly. And in fact, they not only are they the final arbiters, but they said themselves, Connecticut. So there's a lot of different resolutions. People like to quote in nullification the Kentucky resolutions. But it was actually the states united that talked about this. It was Connecticut that they passed a resolution talking about nullification. It says that this is the Connecticut resolution of 1809. Okay? It says, resolved that to preserve the Union and support the Constitution of the United States, it becomes the duty of the legislatures of the states in such a crisis of affairs vigilantly to watch over and vigorously to maintain the powers not delegated to the United States but reserved to the states. So nullification is how you preserve the country. It's how you preserve the rule of law. It's enforcement of the law. People saying that that's anarchy. Now the states can do whatever they want. That's how you enforce the law. Mm-hmm. Nullification is law enforcement as opposed to anarchy. It's the exact opposite.
It's the
of
state
lawlessness.
saying, no, we are going to follow the law. You, federal government, are doing chaos and being anarchical.
Right. And so we can see that right now. Certainly right now, the federal government is in a state of lawlessness because they are not following the law. They are the one that are lawless, not those that want to enforce the Constitution. Mm-hmm. And so the Founding Fathers, over and over again in the Kentucky Resolutions, Thomas Jefferson said, a nullification of the act, meaning an illegal act of the government, is the rightful remedy, okay? On another occasion, Thomas Jefferson said, quote, if those who administer the general government be permitted to transgress the limits fixed by that compact by a total disregard to the special delegations of power therein contained, an annihilation of the state governments, and the creation upon their ruins of a general consolidated government will be the inevitable consequences. So he's saying that if nullification is not allowed, if the federal government is the final arbiter, then that's the destruction of the Constitution. That's the destruction of our republic. And so there's a myth out there, this lie that says, well, the war between the states solved this problem. It said first, and last, that the federal government or the general government is the last arbiter of what the Constitution says. But even Abraham Lincoln, people that say that he was, the destroyer of the Constitution and the one that implemented this federal government or general government being the final arbiter, he himself said, quote, but if the policy of the government upon a vital question affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by the decisions of the Supreme Court, the moment they are made, the people will have ceased to be their own masters. So even Abraham Lincoln says that if the Supreme Court is the final arbiter, we're done.
See, well, just to kind of explain, because I've often felt that the Civil War is a major turning point for the Constitution and where the federal government really loses some key links on the chain around it via the 14th Amendment, via Reconstruction, and just how because and that's what we're taught in schools is
right.
the Civil War settled once and for all that the federal government is supreme to the states. And from what I'm understanding, you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I think that you'll have some things to share that will show this.
Yeah.
When Abraham Lincoln and those who passed the 14th Amendment ratified it, and there's even questions whether or not it was really ratified at all. Legally.
Right.
But let's say it is. Those people who did that and who were at that time, how they envisioned what they were doing and their intention was not to essentially emasculate the states and chain them down to a supreme federal power. It's just how future generations, such as the progressives and the progressive movement, which is late 18th century, early 19th century, early 20th century people, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, these guys, they took essentially a tool that they saw in the 14th Amendment and in how Reconstruction went. They said, aha, a sword, let me use that sword in a way I would like to use it. Is that correct?
Well, that's the real problem with the 14th Amendment, because it's just like it's the antithesis of every amendment before it. It says that Congress has the authority to implement or enforce it however they see fit. And so that turns the Constitution on its head. And so that part of that. And so getting into intention, it's hard to tell, but we know that that final part of that amendment just kind of it leaves the door open for evil people to do evil things.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, because one thing I'm still squaring with for myself is whether or not the 14th Amendment was necessary or not. Because I mean, if you look at early American history, you can find plenty of times where states were the culprit or the source of tyranny or bad behavior. I mean, I think that's undeniable that the states did that. I don't know how much the Founding Fathers anticipated that being the case. I think that they were more concerned about national government being that source. But for most of the early republic, it was states being the source of this problem. And so I can see the argument behind that. Well, somehow you need to prevent states who can be just as destructive as the national government from doing these bad things too. We do have state constitutions. If you read, I mean, and the thing is, our Constitution is largely based off the Virginia Constitution that they had on the Pennsylvania one. If you read those early constitutions, that they're very similar, and in some ways go even beyond what our Constitution says with regards to limiting the government. Yeah. But what do you do then? And we talked a little bit about this yesterday on Paul's show. Yeah. And what Suzanne said, essentially, and if I'm wrong, Suzanne, and you're listening. Send me a Facebook message, and I'll be sure to correct myself. But voting with your feet, in the sense what a lot of people are doing in California. I don't like how California's running. I'm leaving. Try to change your own laws. That's one of the beauties of local government is you have a greater chance of actually making a difference as an individual on the local level, as opposed to the national level. And then the third being just straight up just disobedience, civil disobedience. All well and good, all good things, and I definitely think that those are things that we can do. But at the same time, the government, law, is supposed to be organized justice. Mm-hmm. Their job is to be doing justice. And when you have a corruption of that on a state level, and you lose, let's just use Mormons in Missouri as an example. Yeah. You're driven from your homes, murder, all these kinds of things that happen. You voting with your feet isn't justice. That's just you getting out of a really crappy situation. But justice hasn't been done. The law hasn't been settled. And from what I understand, and maybe you can correct me, under the pre-14th Amendment kind of situation, they could have left. They could have changed laws, which they did. Mm-hmm. Civil disobedience, they also did. Mm-hmm. They were dumb in giving up their guns. I'll say that for sure. But there's no path. There's no justice. There's no path to justice. And essentially, Martin Van Buren is right in saying, "I'm sorry, your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you." Right. So that situation, I think it's a false choice to say that you can either have full-on state power and either as if the 14th Amendment and states' rights are mutually exclusive.
So you're saying that it's a false dichotomy.
It's a false. You're basically saying Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump. You pick. My answer is no. And so that's just kind of where I'm at right now. Is I feel like that's a false choice. Right. And maybe you have a different opinion about that, but from what you understand of the early republic, was Martin Van Buren right? Was there really nothing he could do as the president to stop that kind of thing? Would have been inappropriate or unconstitutional at that point for him to send federal troops to Missouri to provide protection. Would that have been an overstep?
So it's
It's
I think
really
that
complicated.
There's some fundamental things we have to look at first.
Okay, let's do that then.
And so, to kind of lay the foundation there, Joseph Smith, using the Missouri situation, he said that there was one flaw in the Constitution, that there was no way to enforce it. He said that, if there was one thing that he would change in it is that it would be capital punishment for those officials that disobeyed, that violated their oath of office. But there wasn't that.
Where do you sign for that? Because not that I literally...
That's an amendment we could go for, right?
Convention of States, you want my support? There you go.
That's your one and only amendment. And so...
And getting rid of the 17th and 16th.
Well, the 17th, we can get into that
We'll
later if we
get
got
that,
time, because that's an illegal amendment straight up. James Madison, I've talked about this before, and I think this is really getting down to the root of it. He says, "Is there no virtue among us? If there be not, we are in a wretched situation. No theoretical checks, no form of government can render us secure. To suppose that any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without any virtue in the people is a chimerical, meaning imaginative idea. It's fake. It can't happen." Okay? So no matter what government, you've got the 14th Amendment, you've got no 14th Amendment, if we are a wicked people, we are going to have tyranny.
Absolutely.
End of story.
100% agree. And that's why it's so sad to see the First Amendment, which says the Establishment Clause, has been used as essentially a baton to chase religion and morality outside of the public circle, outside of the public square. It's a circle now. It used to be a square. We have a circle now. But that's what I mean. My point being is we've done a lot and tried to use government as a way to take morality out of our country. Right. Because previously, under the founders, Thomas Jefferson made a big point when he was president to be seen praying, to go to these kinds of events, to have religious people come. George Washington also, they were fine with government and religion being in a relationship in the sense of government allowing religion to have a platform.
Well, not only that,
speak.
Before the 14th Amendment, individual states had the authority, because it's not talked about in the Constitution, to have state religions. Massachusetts, the official state religion of Massachusetts was Catholicism. That was not. It was the 14th Amendment that got rid of
Maryland. It was Maryland.
Yeah.
But at the same time, none of the founders would have said, and thus it's okay if you have a state religion in Utah, which maybe LDS, who knows? Let's say that they thought that was okay. They never would have sanctioned, though, the state of Utah then saying, and if you're not a Mormon, we will punish you.
Or we'll kill you. Yeah.
Or we'll kill
take
you
away
or
your
take
property.
your stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's another thing. I think we set up these false choices in our brains where we think government and religion close together equals 17th and 16th century England and France.
Right.
Or you have to have what we have now. And it's a false choice.
Right.
And you have to recognize that for the founders, they saw that you can have a relationship here between government and religion. The fact that we have people who say prayers in Congress, the fact that the president can say we should be religious, we should be this, that's not tyranny. That's just using the bully pulpit as an advocate. But as long as there's no force, no gun to people's heads, or no taxes used, they would have been fine.
They understood you couldn't have this system because this, dangerous liberty, right? Mm-hmm. You cannot have, this liberty's dangerous.
Oh, yeah.
And you can't have it unless you're a moral people. Mm-hmm. The Founding Fathers said moral and religious. And that is the check and balance, is the people themselves. If the people don't have that check and balance, how in the world can the people that they've delegated authority to have that check and balance?
How can the creation rise above the creator? We use that as an explanation for why the government can't have power or rights that we don't as individuals. Right. And I think you make a really good point. The same thing with morality. We can't expect the government's morality to rise above our morality because it is derived from us. It's a bottom-up system, not a top-down.
Right.
Well, we actually have to go to a break, but don't go away. We will be back in just a few minutes. We got to let the people who keep the lights on get their say, and we'll be back. This is the New Guard Show.
Hi, I'm Kate Daly of The Kate Show on the Blaze Radio Network, as well as The Kate Daly Show on Fox News AM 1450 KZNU Daily. I have been following Defending Utah and having them on my show for the past year now. Their research is getting down to what is really happening, and it's always really impressed me. They always cite their sources, so you can trust but verify. And shouldn't we all be doing that? As a source for investigative journalism, Defending Utah covers the stories others are just too often afraid to touch. Defending Utah literally has the stories you're not going to see anywhere else. They do the digging, and boy, do they do it well. They uncover stories about what's going on in Utah that nobody else does. But I think what's really great about Defending Utah is that they're organizing to help you stand up and do something to defend liberty and to stop those that are working to enslave everybody. They actually offer solutions to help you know what to do and how to do it. These guys are fantastic. Please join me in giving your support to Defending Utah. If you really want to affect change, support good and honest journalism. Support Defending Utah.
Back, welcome to the New Guard Show. I am your host, Jacob Hibbard, coming to you live on K-Talk, AM 1640. Joined this morning by Ben McClintock from Defending Utah. And we were really having a really great substantive discussion about the Constitution, about the 10th Amendment and nullification and why it's important and how the founders thought about it and what were the fundamental philosophical bases for this principle. Because you have to understand the base and you have to understand the context to understand the lines that we're reading here. And I want to thank Ben again so much for helping us go through this, and just turn the time over to you.
Yeah,
you want to go next.
I wanted to answer your, kind of finish answering your question about, that we've got this false dichotomy of, we've got to have big government because the states are going to violate your rights. Okay, and so that was something that going back to because we used the Missouri persecution against the saints as an example, and so they
easy one for a Mormon to think of.
so they had to flee. So what happened, right? So they go then to they have another situation, recognizing, okay, the federal government can't do anything to help us, so what do we do to be able to protect ourselves? And this is something the Founding Fathers did. Not only were they in favor of nullification after the formation of the government, the Founding Fathers promoted nullification. That's how they got rid of England. They were nullifying.
They nullified it.
They nullified it. We talk about unconstitutional acts of government today. If you read the writings of the Founding Fathers selling independence, they talked about the unconstitutional acts of England, and they talked about nullifying the acts of the English government. So they set up these things called committees of correspondence and committees of safety to be able to enforce the law. And so this is also used during the days of Texas when they were getting independence from England. But these were also set up. There was the Nauvoo Legion. There's a story. This is recorded in the Journal of Discourses, Volume 2, page 168. Joseph Smith is telling a story about what happened to him in Ottawa. So he said, it's a really important story, but I'm going to read it. It says, "We started for Ottawa and arrived at Pawpaw Grove, 32 miles, where we stopped for the night. Squire Walker sent Mr. Campbell, sheriff of Lee County, to my assistance, and he came and slept by me. In the morning, certain men wished to see me, but I was not allowed to see them. The news of my arrival had hastily circulated about the neighborhood, and very early in the morning the largest room in the hotel was filled with citizens, who were anxious to hear me preach and requested me to address them. Sheriff Reynolds entered the room and said, pointing to me, 'I wish you to understand this man is my prisoner, and I want you should disperse. You must not gather round here in this way.' So the sheriff is telling everybody to get out of the room, and that Joe Smith is his prisoner. Upon which an aged gentleman who was lame and carried a large hickory walking stick, so this old man that can't even walk, advanced towards the sheriff, bringing his hickory upon the floor, stomping his cane on the floor, says, 'You damned infernal puked. We'll learn you to come here and interrupt gentlemen. Sit down,' pointing to a very low chair, 'and sit still.' Talking to the sheriff, right? 'Don't open your head till General Smith gets through talking. If you never learn manners in Missouri, we'll teach you that gentlemen are not to be imposed upon by a slave driver. You cannot kidnap men here, and if you do in Missouri, and if you attempt it here, there's a committee in this grove that will sit on your case, and sir, it is the highest tribunal in the United States.'" So it's talking about these local communities, because where does government come from, right? If the federal government's not the final arbiter, it's the states because they created it. Well, who created the states? The people. Okay? So the people are the final arbiter, even above the states, because they're the ones that created all of it. And so this is an example of nullification. The people were saying, you know what, sheriff, even the sheriff's not the ultimate authority. The people are the ultimate authority. This guy told the sheriff to sit down and be quiet and because he was doing something illegal.
Which is where you get jury nullification comes into play as well.
Right.
Where you can convict somebody of a crime and then say, but we will not assign anything here.
Right.
Yeah, we're not going to give him any punishment.
And that happens today. Defending Utah was actually involved in a case of a guy that was prosecuted for defending his own property in Provo. And they were able to get even this anti-gun member of the jury said, you know what, you were wrongfully prosecuted. And so even though your own lawyer said you broke the law, we said that law was invalid and found this guy in Provo. This is in 2017, jury nullification in the state of Utah. That's our role as the people.
Beautiful, beautiful.
And so these things, weren't done away. These things are continuing to go along. I think it's really important to understand this idea of what does it mean if you're really against nullification. The examples, people say, well, that's to promote racism and all these different things.
States' rights has been made to be equated with racism and mistreatment of blacks and all sorts of bad behavior. And during the break, you guys, if you were on Facebook Live, you would have heard this part of our conversation, but that it's a communist tactic, and if I misquote you, Ben, to look at a real problem, a true problem that's there, and then propose a solution to this problem that's real that actually is anti-freedom and often, in most cases, doesn't even solve that initial problem.
So the southern states were involved in nullification, but you know what? The northern states were also involved in it. There was the Fugitive Slave Act that said that if you found a runaway slave, you were required by law
to
return it. But there were people, and they were encouraged by the northern states to nullify that law. So if you're against nullification, that means you're in favor of the people enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. And you are saying that those people, because they don't want to be anarchists, they don't want to be lawless, they've got to return those slaves. That's what we're saying. And so to say that there's no mechanism, no, the 10th Amendment says that's the mechanism, that it's up to the states to figure out how to nullify an illegal law. And so this is done over and over again. This is done in our day. 21 states nullified the Real ID Act. This is a national ID card that was passed by Congress in 2003. The states are saying, no, Congress, guess what? Article 1, Section 8, you've got no authority to do a national ID. It's illegal to pass to make our ID a part of this program. This happens over and over and over again in our time, where just like with right now, there's a ballot initiative to legalize legalize marijuana.
And there's a difference between decriminalizing something and legalizing it.
So this one's legalizing it, and it would, which is a nullification of federal law. So if you're in favor of this initiative that's going out there, that means you're in favor of nullification.
You anarchist.
You're so lawless. No, the Founding Fathers said that's how you actually protect the law.
This is how you live in a free society. It's the great. I mean, the Second Amendment's a great final check on government. But before you get there, nullification is a simple constitutional means of preserving a free society. There's a really beautiful word in the English language. You might have heard it before. It's called no.
Right.
This is how we say no when the government goes beyond its means, when the Constitution is being violated by a lawless federal government. This is about, like as Ben said at the beginning of the hour, this is about a lawless federal government being brought to heel by law-abiding states by saying the actions you are doing are illegal.
Right.
It's like saying that the police officer is being lawless when he manhandles someone and arrests him.
Right.
Oh, that's assault and battery. Well, no, it's him doing his job. That's the job of the police officer. Of course, you don't have to be excessive, and we don't want to open up the police brutality conversation. But that's my point.
But if they're enforcing legitimate law,
if you're enforcing the law,
legitimate
as a police officer, legitimately enforcing the law, and you have to shoot someone, did you kill someone? Technically, yes. But you're enforcing the law. This is about reigning in government that has been unleashed, not about unleashing chaos within the states.
Exactly. And I think that's an important thing that we have to remember and this is not something, in Utah we have this this mindset of we have to obey the law of the land no matter what the government says. But I want to bring up some interesting quotes. This is in modern times even. We've got in General Conference in 1949, Joseph F. Merrill in General Conference saying, "A state is just a large number of individuals. In the end, it is subject to the same limitations as the individual. They can't do things just because, that they're the government." And then there's another thing, like the very actually formation of our state, the idea of why we're even here in the first place is because we fled a government acting illegally. We fled the United States to actually live by the Constitution. And so there was civil disobedience was something that was very popular amongst the foundations, not only of our country, but of our state. And John Taylor very famously said, "I defy the United States." They talked about how if the law of the government that the Congress passes violates the Constitution, it is our duty to ignore it. That is the action of a free man as somebody that's actually standing up. The Founding Fathers said that disobedience to tyrants is obedience to God.
That's actually the subtext of the newguards.net. The New Guards slogan is that phrase in Latin, Tyrannis sedito obesquium Deo est. That's the New Guard slogan. It's a great slogan. You guys should memorize that.
The Founding Fathers, the first president, this is an official first presidency announcement, says, "Whatever is contrary to the freedom guaranteed in the Constitution, which includes not mere belief, but the free exercise of religion, he does not command his people to obey." Okay? So, this idea that we're subject to the government no matter what they say is a complete misnomer. That would mean that the Founding Fathers were wrong.
It's flipping the orientation of government on its head.
Right.
Like I said earlier, that we are a bottom-up government, not a top-down.
Right.
And that attitude inverts that relationship.
It says that everything that we're founded upon was wrong. We should be all English subjects if we are supposed to do whatever the government says, and that we're anarchist or that we're lawless or that we just want chaos if we are going to actually nullify the illegal actions of the government. Mm-hmm. And so not only just the federal government, but it's the example of these people telling the sheriff to sit down and shut up. Any level of government, because where does the government get its power?
From the people.
From the people.
And that's not to imply that just because you don't like something the government does,
no, that's
again
a false dichotomy.
That's a false dichotomy. And just since we've pulled the Mormon card, we're going to play it again. If you read Section 134 of the Doctrine and Covenants, which is considered doctrine for members of the LDS Church, it is a wonderful section that outlines the Church's belief about government, the divine view of government. Some great verses like verse 2, "We believe that no government can exist in peace except such laws are framed and held inviolate as will secure to each individual the free exercise of conscience, the right and control of property, and the protection of life." Later on in the section, though, it says that we believe that all men are bound to sustain and uphold the respective governments in which they reside, while protected in their inherent and inalienable rights by the laws of such governments.
Right.
There is a caveat to that. We usually just read the first part of the line, but there is that second line that there is that continuity. These laws need to be need to be protecting your rights.
And if they're not, going back to Section 98, actually, it says that we are supposed to shun any law that does not protect our liberty. Mm-hmm. And so it's an essential thing for us to understand. And the idea that, the government, we've got to, that this is just chaos and that if we follow this, then that means people can do whatever they want. Well, of course not, because, first we talked about James Madison saying, so we've got to be a moral people, because then that's just going to go crazy. But because we've got our society in general, that's not going to allow me to say, I think I've got the liberty to kill people. That's just ridiculous, because nobody around me is going to put up with that.
Yeah, because we'll shoot first.
Which is another reason why we have these rights to defend ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so we go back to the Founding Fathers in another resolution. It talked about that it says that the government created by this compact was not made the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself. Each party has an equal right to judge for itself as well of infractions as of the mode and measure of redress. So it's up to us. They've set up the legal mechanism. It is up to us to be able to enforce that. And so I think we've got just a few minutes. I wanted to kind of get into the 17th
we've got about
Amendment.
2 minutes.
The 17th Amendment, okay, Article 5. We're talking about Article 5. What's the last part of Article 5 say? It says that no state shall have its suffrage taken from them without their consent. Okay, the Constitution, when it changed, like, so when we got rid of Prohibition, right? To get a Prohibition, you had to have an amendment. To get rid of Prohibition, you had to have an amendment. The 17th Amendment, it's one of those things where it actually had to be unanimous for it to be legal.
Because it would change the suffrage.
It took away the votes of the states. But there were states that voted no, Utah being one of them. And so the 17th Amendment, by its definition, is an unconstitutional amendment because it was never passed unanimously, because that's one amendment that would need that. It would actually, the 17th Amendment, to be legal, would actually have to say that portion of Article 5 has to be repealed specifically, and then that repeal has to be passed unanimously. It wasn't. And so it is the duty of the states then to find their own remedy to that situation.
Fantastic. Well, we have come to the end of our hour. It goes so fast. But I want to thank you, Ben. Thank you so much for coming in. I think this has been a fantastic, substantive discussion about these important ideas. It's so important that we understand the foundations that our country is built on, why the founders believed what they did, and how that impacts us today. The only reason why someone would say to you that what the founders think doesn't matter is because they don't want you to know what they thought. And they don't want you to understand the Constitution. Don't trust those people. Trust the Constitution. Read what the founders said. Study up on this. We are to live in a free society. Our Constitution guarantees and creates a situation for a free society. You're more free than you think you are. And as soon as we understand that, we can have the country that the founders wanted. Well, we are going to be back tomorrow at the same time. We're going to be joined tomorrow by James Evans, former chair of the...
This Defending Utah program was brought to you by the Defending Utah Liberty Store, where you can buy, among other things, the United States Constitution Made Easy by Lonnie Crockett, Ph.D. It was also brought to you by Anderson Accounting, 801-255-0396. Truss Plumbing, 801-808-5470. Higher Calling Firearms, highercallingfirearms.com. Mini Zoo comes to you, 801-414-5279. American Appliance, 801-254-2566. The Editor Lady at gmail.com. Shem Financial Services, 801-856-6151. The Law Offices of Garrett T. Smith, 385-439-0247.